The land stretched wide and empty, the way only the American West could. Dry winds pushed over the prairie, rattling old fence posts and carrying with them the faint smell of sage. The sky above seemed to go on forever, so blue it hurt to look. At and beneath it, not a soul stirred. For 10 long years, the cowboy had lived in silence out here on the edge of nowhere. He hadn't spoken to another living person, hadn't shared a meal, hadn't heard laughter except in memory. His only company was the creak of his cabin timbers, the groan of the windmill, and the lonely call of a hawk circling overhead. Folks in town had long stopped wondering if he was alive, and maybe that suited him just fine. He had built his life on routine, the kind that dulled the ache of loneliness. At sunrise he tended to the cattle, though there were fewer now than when he'd first started. At noon he patched fences that never seemed to hold, and at sundown he sat on his porch, hat pulled low, staring out at the horizon as the land swallowed the sun whole. Days bled into years, and the cowboy let them, never asking for more. People had been trouble once trouble he'd paid dearly for, so, he told himself, it was better this way. Better to keep the world out. But the world had a way of finding you, even when you swore it wouldn't. It happened on a day like any other. The air was sharp, holding the bite of early autumn, and the sky had turned the pale color of tin. He was fixing the latch on his barn door when he heard a sound. That didn't belong. It's not wind, not animal, not the groan of wood. It was faint, almost carried off before it reached him, but it was there. Voices weak and strained. He froze, head cocked, heart thudding in his chest. Then it came again, closer this time. Before he could make sense of it, he saw movement at the edge of his land. 4 figures stumbled toward his gate, their steps uneven, their clothes torn and dusty. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks. He hadn't seen a person in so long that shadows sometimes look like company. This wasn't shadows. These were girls young, maybe no more than late teens or a little older. Their long hair was tangled, their faces streaked with dirt, their eyes wide with exhaustion. They were native, their dress and beads marking them clear as day. And before he could draw a breath, the first one collapsed, crumpling like a rag. Dull at the gate post. The others followed, one after the other, until all 4 lay in the dust. Still and silent, the cowboy stood rooted to the ground, the hammer slipping from his hand. His mind scrambled for answers. Where had they come from? The nearest village was days away on horseback, the nearest town farther still. Why here, why his place, after so many years of emptiness? The questions pressed at him, but his body moved before his thoughts did. He was at the gate in moments, kneeling beside them, his rough hands hovering uncertainly over their fragile forms. He saw bruises on their arms, blistered feet from miles of walking, and lips cracked from thirst. Whoever they were, whatever road had led them here, it hadn't been an easy one. He lifted one gently, her head lolling against his shoulder. She stirred faintly, her breath shallow, whispering words he couldn't make out. Her voice was broken, like wind through brittle grass. He leaned closer, straining to catch them, but the sound slipped away. Still, he heard enough to know it was no ordinary wandering that had brought them. There was fear in her tone, an urgency. As if she'd held on to her strength for this moment alone, the cowboy carried her toward the porch. Motioning to the others to follow, though they could not, he laid her down carefully on the boards, then returned for the rest, one by one. By the time he finished, his chest was heaving, his arms burning, and the weight of it all settled heavy in his gut. He hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted it, but here it was, sprawled at his doorstep like fate itself. As he fetched water and blankets, his mind kept circling back at what had driven them across such harsh country. Why hadn't they gone too? The settlement south of here, where there were families and supplies. He couldn't shake the feeling that trouble followed close behind them. The kind of trouble that could stir up dust across miles of desert and land square at his door. When one of the girls finally stirred, opening her eyes, he knelt beside her. Her gaze was sharp despite her exhaustion, searching his face as if weighing whether he could be trusted. He didn't speak, not yet. Words felt foreign after so long. Instead, he offered her the tin cup of water. She drank slow and cautious, then pulled back with trembling hands. Her lips moved, forming words at last. But before she could speak, before her story could tumble out into the open, a sound cut through the silence. Hoofbeats, distant but steady, drawing closer with every passing second. The cowboy's heart clenched. 10 years he'd lived without another soul in sight. And now, in the space of an hour, 4 strangers lay at his gate hand. Someone else was coming fast across the prairie. He rose to his feet, staring out at the horizon, jaw tight, waiting to see who or what was about to ride into his life. The girls shifted uneasily, one clutching the other's hand, eyes darting toward the sound with something like dread. The cowboy saw it, and in that instant he knew whatever storm had driven them here was not done yet. And as the hoofbeats drew nearer, thundering louder with each breath, he braced himself, caught between the life he had chosen and the one that seemed to be choosing him now. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing against the empty prairie like a drumbeat warning of something unwelcome. The cowboy stood still, one hand resting on the wooden post of his porch, his eyes narrowed against the fading light. Whoever was coming rode with purpose. He could tell by the rhythm, steady and unbroken, not the meandering gait of a traveler, but the pressing gallop of someone who knew where they were headed. His gut twisted, and though he hadn't spoken a word in a decade, one thought passed through him clear as speech. They weren't coming by chance. The 4 girls shifted where they lay on the porch. One, the eldest by the look of her, tried to sit up, wincing as she pressed her hand against a bruised side. Her eyes darted toward the horizon, then back to the cowboy, her lips parting as if she might say something. But no words came. Instead, her gaze told him all he needed. It was fear, sharp and raw, carved deep in her face. Whatever was chasing them was still out there. It was getting close. The cowboy took a step back into the shadow of his cabin. He had lived too long in silence to invite danger willingly, but life rarely asked permission. He reached for the rifle propped near the door, its wood worn smooth by years of use, though it hadn't been fired in a long time. His hands remembered it like an old friend, steady even as his heart thudded. He checked the chamber, then leaned it against the porch rail, plain in sight. Whoever rode up would see he wasn't unarmed. The hoofbeats slowed as the rider came into view, a dark figure cresting the ridge beyond his land. The sun was sinking, bleeding red across the sky, and the rider's silhouette looked near black against it. Dust trailed behind the horse, rising like smoke, and the cowboy felt every nerve in his body tighten. He didn't move, didn't call. Out, just waited. The rider pulled up short of the gate, not crossing it, but sitting tall in the saddle. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed the face, and the horse pawed at the dirt, snorting. For a long breath, no one spoke. The only sound was the restless shifting of the girls on the porch and the rasp of the wind through dry grass. Finally, the rider lifted a hand, pushing the hat back just enough to show a weather-worn face, hard, scarred and unreadable. "You got company," the rider said, voice low but carrying across the distance. The cowboy didn't answer. Words came slow after years of silence, and besides, he wanted to hear more before giving anything away. The rider's eyes flicked toward the girls, then back to him. "They don't belong here. You know that." Still, the cowboy stayed quiet, his jaw set. He could feel the eyes of the eldest girl on him, pleading though she said nothing. "They've been running," the rider went on, "and if you've got sense, you'll send 'em back out. Trouble sticks to their kind, and you don't want it at your door." The cowboy's grip on the porch post tightened. He'd lived 10 years without neighbors, 10 years without talk, and now he stood at the edge of something he couldn't quite see. He thought of shutting the gate, of letting the rider take them, and whatever danger they carried. But when he looked down at the girls, pale and worn and barely breathing, something inside him stirred. Something he thought he'd buried years ago. The rider must have seen it too, because his expression hardened. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "But don't say you weren't warned." He tugged the reins, turning the horse. Dust kicked up as hooves pounded away, fading back into the distance until the sound was gone. Silence returned, thick and heavy. The cowboy stayed rooted where he was, staring after the rider long after he vanished. His thoughts tangled, caught, between caution and the old code he'd once lived, by help those who can't help themselves. It was a code that had cost him everything once, and he'd sworn never to follow it again. Yet here he was, with 4 strangers on his porch and a warning echoing in his ears. That night, the prairie air grew colder, sharp with the first hint of frost. Inside the cabin, the cowboy lit a lantern, the warm glow flickering across rough-hewn walls. He gave the girls food, simple bread and beans from a pot that had simmered too long, and they ate slowly, as if each bite took effort. Their silence filled the room, but it wasn't the quiet he was used to. This silence had weight, secrets pressing against it. After the meal, the eldest spoke, her voice raspy but clear. "We walked for days," she said. "No water, no fire, only sky and dirt. We thought we would die before we found anyone." The cowboy listened, his eyes fixed on the lantern flame. He didn't push her, didn't ask the questions clawing at his mind, but he let her words spill. "There were men," she went on. Her hands tightened around the cup she held, knuckles white. "They came to our village. They said what they wanted, burned what they didn't. We ran." The others, her voice broke and she swallowed hard, forcing the rest down. Had no place else to go. The cowboy's jaw worked, but still he said nothing. He could feel the old ache creeping back, the one he'd tried so long to forget. Images of smoke and fire, of things lost that could never return, rose unbidden in his mind. He pushed them back, locking them tight. But the weight of her story settled heavy all the same. The youngest girl stirred then, her eyes glassy with fever. She whispered something in her tongue, words the cowboy couldn't understand, and the eldest bent close to soothe her. Watch them, their closeness, the way they clung to one another in a world that had offered them nothing but pain. Later, when the cabin had gone still, he stepped outside. The night was wide and endless, stars spread across it like spilled salt. He leaned against the porch rail, rifle at his side, and listened. The land was quiet, but his mind was not. The rider's warning echoed in him, and he knew trouble had not passed. Trouble had only begun. He thought about saddling his horse, riding through the dark to the settlement to send for help. But the thought died as quick as it came. The world beyond his land was no friend of his, and he doubted it would be theirs. If anyone was coming for them, it wasn't to lend a hand. As he stood there, the faintest sound reached him again far off, barely more than a whisper against the wind. Hoofbeats. Not one this time, but many. Slow, steady, moving across the night like thunder, still too far to see. The cowboy's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the rifle. Behind him, in the cabin's glow, 4 girls slept uneasily, shadows of fear still etched on their faces. Out on the prairie, the darkness stirred, carrying with it the promise of what was yet to come. And as the hoofbeats rolled closer, the cowboy knew the quiet life he had clung to for 10 long years had ended the moment they fell at his gate. Whatever storm had started out, there was now his face, whether he wanted it or not. The hoofbeats did not fade. They lingered in the distance, steady, growing stronger as the hours passed, like a storm gathering strength before it broke. The cowboy sat on the porch through most of the night, rifle across his lap, listening to the rhythm out on the prairie. The girls stirred restlessly inside, waking in fits, whispering among themselves in low voices he could not understand. Knew they felt it, tooth and nearness of danger pressing closer with each mile. By dawn the hoofbeats had gone quiet, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. The cowboy's eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep as he stepped inside the cabin. The eldest girl was already awake, her back straight, her eyes steady on him. She did not flinch at the sight of the rifle. Instead, she nodded, as though she expected it. "They'll come," she said. Her voice had gained strength overnight. "They always come." The cowboy studied her face, the set of her jaw, the weight of someone who had seen too much too soon. He wanted to ask who these men were, what they wanted, but the words stayed caught in his throat. He had spent too long without talk, too long carrying his own ghosts, and speaking of them had never made them lighter. Instead, he simply poured water into a tin cup and slid it across the table. She accepted, drinking slow, then set the cup down with care. The younger ones stirred awake soon after. One of them, no more than 12 by the look of her, limped badly as she tried to rise. Her ankle was swollen, the skin angry and bruised. The cowboy fetched a strip of cloth, wrapping it firm, his rough hands surprisingly careful. She looked up at him with wide eyes, caught between fear and gratitude. And for a brief moment, he saw the world as it had been long ago, before loss, before silence, before he'd chosen to live apart. He quickly pushed the thought away. That morning he saddled his horse and rode the ridge beyond his land, scanning the horizon. The plains stretched endless, but in the distance he spotted the faint scar of a campfire, a smudge of smoke rising against the pale sky. Whoever had camped, there wasn't hiding. They wanted to be seen, or didn't care if they were. He stayed long enough to mark the direction, then turned back, uneasy, gnawing at his gut. When he returned, the eldest girl was waiting by the gate. "They're close, aren't they?" she asked. He gave the smallest nod. She drew in a breath, steadying herself. "We can't stay here. If we do, they'll find us and you'll pay for it." The cowboy looked past her, toward the cabin where the younger ones sat huddled by the fire. Leaving wasn't an option, not with their condition. The youngest was fevered, her cheeks flushed, her body trembling beneath the thin blanket. Another day of walking would likely kill her. And yet staying meant drawing danger to his own doorstep. He found himself caught in a trap he hadn't chosen. As the day dragged on, tension coiled tighter. He busied himself with chores, chopping wood, checking the well, tending to the meager cattle he still had. But every sound of Recrow's call, every groan of the windmill set his nerves on edge. The girls stayed close, watching him, whispering among themselves when they thought he wasn't listening. He could tell they didn't trust him fully, not yet, though the eldest carried herself with a quiet resolve that reminded him of someone. He once knew by evening the sky had turned the color of iron, clouds stacked heavy on the horizon, promising rain. The cowboy sat sharpening his knife when the eldest finally spoke again. "They're not just men," she said softly.
"Out there."
"Hunters, they take what they want and chase down the rest. Not until the trail goes cold or until blood is spilled." Her words sat heavy in the air, and the cowboy's hand froze on the blade. He'd known men like that once, long ago, men who believed the world owed them and would burn it to ash. If it didn't, he'd ridden with some, fought against others, buried too many because of them. He thought he'd left that world behind, but here it was. Riding back into his life on the thud of hooves, the eldest leaned forward, lowering her voice even further. "They'll come for us, but they'll come for you too now, because you saw us, because you helped." He met her eyes, the truth of it sinking deep. The storm was no longer theirs alone. It was his now, whether he liked it or not. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat by the fire inside, the rifle across his knees, listening to the restless breaths of the girls as they dozed. The fevered one coughed, her small frame shivering under the blanket, and he felt something stir inside him that he hadn't let himself feel in years' responsibility, sharp and undeniable, near midnight. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke, not the clean smoke of a campfire, but the acrid stench of burning wood. He stepped outside, the chill biting his skin, and saw it. Another smudge of smoke on the horizon, closer now, glowing faint red beneath the clouded sky. He gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body tense. Trouble was moving in, piece by piece. Circling, he could feel it pressing at the edges of his land, waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside, the eldest girl was awake, watching him with dark eyes that seemed older than her years. She didn't ask what he'd seen. She already knew. The cowboy sat back down, running a hand over his face. He thought of his own past, of choices that had left him here, alone and silent for 10 years. He thought of the people he had failed to save, and the ones he had buried with his own hands. He thought of how easy it would be to walk away, too. Ride into the desert and leave the storm to swallow what it would. But when he looked at the 4 girls, worn thin but holding on to each other with everything they had left. He knew he couldn't. Not this time. And so, as the night deepened, and the smoke thickened on the horizon, the cowboy waited. Waiting for the hunters. Waiting for the storm. Waiting for the moment when the silence he had lived in so long would shatter for good. The smoke on the horizon did not fade. By the next morning, the wind carried it clearer, sharper, the kind that came from burning more than a campfire. Cowboy stood on the ridge above his land, hat low, rifle slung over his shoulder. Watching the thin black line stay in the sky, his horse shifted beneath him, uneasy, as though it too could sense the danger drawing closer. He had known it was coming, but knowing didn't make the wait any easier. When he rode back down to the cabin, the girls were gathered by the porch. The eldest met his eyes, searching for an answer he didn't give. She already knew. The younger. One stayed close to her, huddled, their faces pale with dread. The fevered one burned hotter, her breath shallow, but even she seemed to sense the heaviness pressing against the air. The cowboy spent the day preparing, though he didn't say it aloud. He checked the barn doors, tightened the fences, stacked firewood by the cabin wall. His hands worked with the steadiness of habit, but inside, tension twisted like wire pulled too tight. He hadn't expected to fight again. He hadn't wanted to. Yet every sign pointed to a storm about to break across his land, whether he opened the gate or not. That night, the riders came into sight. At first, only faint shadows on the far ridge, then clearer as the sun bled into the horizon. There were more than he had guessed, half a dozen at least, maybe more behind them. They rode slowly, not rushing, not hiding. It was a show of patience, of confidence. Predators circling their prey. The cowboy watched from the porch, his rifle propped against the rail, his jaw tight. The girls stayed inside, but he could feel their eyes on him through the window, waiting, hoping, fearing, the eldest whispered. To the others, her voice low, trying to steady them. But even through the walls, he heard the tremor beneath her words. The riders didn't approach that night. They camped out of sight beyond the ridge, but the glow of their fire flickered in. The dark, the sound of their laughter, harsh and sharp, carried faintly across the prairie. The cowboy lay awake in the chair by the door, rifle across his knees, every muscle coiled. The girls didn't sleep much either. He heard them shifting, whispering, the fevered one coughing in the dark. By dawn, the riders were gone from sight, but their tracks carved deep into the dirt. They were moving slow, deliberate, stretching the weight, letting fear sink deep. The cowboy knew their kind well enough. This was no rush for blood, but a hunt. They'd close in, inch by inch, drawing out the dread. Enjoying it, the cowboy saddled his horse again, riding farther this time, keeping low along the ridges. He spotted them before long, scattered in twos and threes, moving like wolves across. The plains, they weren't just hunting the girls, they were scouting him too, marking the land. Waiting to strike when the trap was tightest. When he returned, the eldest girl was standing by the gate, her face drawn. She looked at him as though she'd aged years in the space of hours. "It won't stop," she said, her voice thin but certain. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The day dragged under a heavy sky. Clouds rolled in, dark and low, swallowing the light. Thunder rumbled far off, a warning of another storm. The cowboy worked silently, setting extra water buckets by the porch, moving the cattle into the far corral, cutting strips of cloth for bandages. Each task felt like stacking stones before a flood, useless, maybe, but something to cling to as evening fell. The riders showed themselves again, this time closer, their horses kicking up dust on the ridge above his land. He counted 7, maybe 8. They didn't ride down, didn't call out. They only sat there, lined against the darkening sky, watching. Their presence was louder than words, louder than gunfire. The girls huddled in the doorway, fear plain on their faces. The youngest, clutching her sister's hand so tight her knuckles went white. The cowboy stood tall on the porch, rifle in hand, staring back at them. His silence spoke its own warning. This land would not be given up easy. For a long breath, no one moved. Then, as the last of the sun slipped away, the riders turned, disappearing once more into the dark. That night the prairie came alive with tension. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries high and wild as if stirred by the scent of fear. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying faint echoes of horses moving through the grass. The cowboy sat by the fire, the girls gathered close behind him, their faces pale in the lantern light. Every sound pulled at him, every silence pressed down harder. The eldest girl finally spoke, her words steady but heavy. "They want us alive," she said. "That's why they wait. But they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." Her eyes flicked to him, searching. "They'll kill you too." The cowboy said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Hours crawled by. The fevered girl tossed and moaned, sweat beading her brow, and the eldest wiped it away with gentle hands. The cowboy stayed by the door, rifle steady across his knees, his eyes on the black beyond the window. Every so often a shadow flickered across the distance, quick as a blink, reminding him they were never far, near midnight. A new sound split the night, a whistle, sharp and shrill, rising above the wind. It was followed by the echo of a laugh, then another, until the prairie seemed to hum with it. The girls flinched, clutching each other tighter, and the cowboy's grip on the rifle hardened. He knew the game had shifted. The hunt was no longer waiting. It was moving closer, circling tight. He stepped outside into the cold, the door creaking shut behind him. The night stretched wide, stars hidden by clouds, the land dim under a rising moon. Somewhere out there, just beyond sight, the riders waited. He could feel their eyes on him, could hear the faint jingle of tack, the restless shuffle of hooves. The storm had gathered and it was about to break. Inside, the girls whispered, their voices laced with fear. Outside, the cowboy stood alone against the dark, the weight of 10 silent years crashing down all at once. The riders had not yet struck, but he could feel it in his bones. The moment was near. The prairie held its breath. And in that stillness, every heartbeat, every whisper of wind, every creak of the earth seemed to draw tighter, sharper, pulling all things toward the moment when silence would shatter into fire and blood. The first gunshot cracked the silence, sharp sound that echoed. Across the prairie, like a hammer striking iron, the cowboy dropped to one knee, rifle raised, eyes searching the dark. The riders had finally moved. Hooves thundered, splitting the night into chaos, the sound of men shouting carried by the wind. The cabin shook with the pounding of horses, the younger girls crying out inside. He fired once, the recoil slamming. Against his shoulder, shadow fell from a horse in the distance, swallowed quickly by the dark. He fired again, then ducked behind the porch post as return fire splintered the wood near his head. The old instincts returned, sharp and sure, his body remembering what his silence had buried inside. The eldest girl pulled the younger ones to the floor, shielding them with her own body. The fevered one whimpered but stayed still, clutching her sister's hand. The cowboy shouted his first words in years, hoarse but fierce, "Stay down!" The riders circled, firing into the cabin, trying to break him. But the cowboy knew this land better than they did. He moved along the shadows, using the porch, the barn, the low fences, firing steady, never wasting a shot. Each bullet was deliberate, and with each one, the riders' confidence cracked. One tried to rush the cabin, charging straight for the door. The cowboy met him head-on, pulling the man clean off his horse, the two grappling in the dirt. Silence broke into a guttural roar as he slammed the rider down, fists and fury doing what words never could. The man stilled, and the cowboy stood, breath ragged. Rifle clutched once more. The storm raged for what felt like hours, though the night was still young. Thunder rolled above, clouds spilling rain across the land, turning dirt into mud. Horses reared and screamed in the downpour. Men cursed, shots cracked. And through it all, the cowboy fought with a strength born not from anger, but from necessity. He was not fighting for himself alone. He was fighting for them, for the 4 strangers who had collapsed at his gate, who had dragged him back into the world he had abandoned. By the time the gunfire stilled, the prairie was littered with silence. Once more, a few riders fled into the darkness, their figures swallowed by the storm, but most did not rise again. The cowboy stood in the rain, chest heaving, hat gone, hair plastered to his face. The rifle sagged in his grip. Its work done. Inside the cabin, the girls waited. When he finally opened the door, they rushed to him, eyes wide, faces pale. The eldest searched his face as though expecting to see death staring back. But he was still standing, bloodied and bruised, but alive. She lowered her head, relief shuddering through her. The fevered girl stirred weakly, whispering in her tongue, and though he didn't understand, he knew it was a prayer. He set the rifle aside, kneeling by her, his calloused hand brushing her forehead. Her fever had broken with the storm. For the first time, she slept peacefully in the days that followed. The land was quiet again, but the silence had changed. The riders were gone, the threat broken, but their shadow lingered. The cowboy buried the dead in shallow graves beyond the ridge, unmarked but not forgotten. He worked in silence as always, but this time the girls stood beside him, watching, learning that even loss could be met with dignity. The eldest spoke more freely now. She told him about the village they had lost, about their families, about the fire that had driven them into the wilderness. She spoke of running, of hiding, of nights spent cold and hungry under the stars. Though the cowboy rarely answered, he listened. Listening was something he had always been good at, and for the first time in years, it mattered again. Slowly the cabin began to change. It was no longer a place of one-man's solitude. The laughter of the younger girls began to echo in the yard as they healed, chasing each other among the fences. The eldest helped with chores, her hands steady, her eyes carrying the same quiet resolve as his. The fevered girl grew stronger, her voice returning in fragments of song that drifted. Through the air at dusk, the cowboy found himself speaking again, halting at first, his voice rough from years of disuse. But the words came simple and few, enough to answer their questions, enough to show them they were safe. His silence had once been his shield, but now it no longer felt like armor, felt like a burden he no longer needed. Seasons turned. Prairie greened with spring, wildflowers painting the land with color. The cabin walls, once weathered and lonely, seemed to stand taller, alive with the warmth of new life within. The cowboy still rose early, still walked the fence line, still carried his rifle when the wind shifted strange. But the weight of his days was lighter now, balanced by the four who had come into his life without warning and refused to leave. 1. Evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky gold, the eldest girl stood beside him on the porch. She looked out at the land, then at him. "You saved us," she said softly. He shook his head. "No," he murmured, voice rough but sure. "You saved me." She didn't argue. She only nodded, understanding more than words could carry. The cowboy had once thought his life ended the day he chose silence, the day he walked away from everything and everyone. But the prairie had its own way of giving back, of filling the emptiness with what was needed most. He had been alone for a decade, cut off from the world, but in the end, the world had come to his gate anyway, broken, desperate hand. In saving them, he had saved himself. The land was still harsh, still lonely, still full of dangers beyond the horizon. But it no longer felt empty. The cabin no longer felt like a grave of memory, but a place of beginning. At night, when the stars burned bright over the prairie, the cowboy sometimes sat by the fire and listened to the girls' voices drifting in song. He let their words, even the ones he couldn't understand, fill the spaces silence had once claimed. And though he knew the world outside still carried hunters, storms, and shadows, he also knew something deeper, that life, no matter how broken, could be stitched together again if you were brave enough to let it. The hoofbeats that once haunted his nights were gone, replaced by laughter, by the quiet rhythm of work and healing. The prairie stretched wide and endless, but for the first time in a long time, the cowboy did not feel lost in it. He belonged again, not because he had found peace alone, but because he had been given something worth standing for. And so the cowboy, who had not seen another soul in a decade, found himself no longer alone. His gate, once the line that kept the world out, had become the place where his life began anew. The silence was broken, and in its place rose a story of survival. Family not bound by blood, but by the fire of what they had endured together. The prairie would always hold its shadows, but the cabin's light burned against it now, steady and strong. And in that light, the cowboy stood with those he had once called strangers, no longer haunted, no longer silenced, simply living, at last, with the world he had almost forgotten he could have.